Now it's time for Viking Mail Call, a weekly show where you, the fans, get to ask the questions on your mind and have them answered by former Minnesota Vikings linebacker and coach, Pete Bursich. And now your host, Tom Moore.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Vikings Mail Call. I'm Tom Moore from VikeFans.com, and joining me as he does each week is the Minnesota Vikings Game Day Radio color analyst, Pete Bursich. Hey, Pete, I meant to ask you this last week, but I got completely sidetracked. I noticed the inaugural Veteran Combine concluded, but I didn't see anything that came across the newswire indicating that somebody picked you up for one of their open linebacker spots. What's up with that?
A couple things. I'm too old and I'm too broken down. So, you do anything to stay in the business and you play until they kick you out. And I was kicked out a long time ago.
Yeah, but you got to stop advertising you're on eBay as slow old linebacker. That's not going to get you anywhere.
No, not with the way the game's going. It's all about speed these days. The game's changed, and you got to be forced to change with it. And I was too slow to play 20 years ago, so I don't know how I do now.
There you go. Well, Pete, I got to tell you, our guest tonight is a man who literally pioneered the world for sports agents. He's represented over 60 first-round picks in the NFL, including a record 8 overall number 1 picks in the NFL draft. His past client list reads like a who's who of the Hall of Fame in Canton, with the likes of Troy Aikman and Steve Young and Howie Long and Jim Harbaugh. And he also had former Vikings Warren Moon, Wade Wilson, and Todd Stussy as his clients. I mean, he negotiated contracts worth over $3 billion. Pete, can you tell the fans who our guest is tonight?
Well, our guest tonight is none other than Super Agent Leigh Steinberg. Lee, thanks for being on the program tonight. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Well, Lee, before I turn it over to Pete, I have to ask you a question about all the clients that we just mentioned that you had. And you have over 150 big name athletes and counting. But my partner Pete Bursich here, he played 7 seasons in the NFL with the Vikings. Do you ever consider your career to be incomplete because you couldn't get Pete to sign with you?
I sit up nights just feeling like my life has just been incomplete and wondering how to get meaning because I was not able to get Pete as a client.
Well, see, the problem with telling him that now is, now he's got your phone number. He'll be calling you at nights to make sure you're thinking about him. Well, Lee, in the 1980s, all the way until really when Ziggy Wilk purchased the Vikings in 2005, the Minnesota Vikings were always referred to as a very frugal, even a cheap franchise when it came to signing their players. And you've had Vikings as clients. Why did the prior front office earn the reputation? And what was your experience like when you negotiated with the Vikings?
Well, back in those days, it was Mike Lynn, and the Vikings were able to create an alternative reality, which left the rest of the NFL behind. They simply established a way of paying rookies and veterans that was significantly lower than virtually any other team, and back when the rules did not permit free agency, and a team like the Vikings had total rights over a rookie, his only option was to sit out, there really was no leverage or alternative. So they were able to enforce, based on the fact that they called it a smaller market and a smaller stadium, a completely different pay scale than what was present for other teams at that time.
Yeah. Well, I know, as we kind of roll in, that's one of the things I know, Pete, you wanted to ask him. I mean, you've seen things that are unusual. I know you had a question about Daunte Culpepper.
Yeah, in 2006, when Brad Childress took over the team, I know Daunte, who was a teammate of mine and coached, decided to represent himself. And as a player, I never thought that was a good idea. I'm sure as an agent, you don't think it's a good idea, but just tell our listeners why. Why is it not a good idea? Because I think, listeners think, why would a player pay 2 to 5% or whatever he's paying to have someone represent him?
Well, the fee cap in the NFL is 3% of a contract as money comes to him. And the real question is, why not? Because a skilled agent has the ability to, in a rookie negotiation, sit in between a player and management, and instead of personalizing it, making it a issue of what value is. And with total access to every comparable salary statistic and all the rest. And it does serve as a buffer. I remember my first client, Steve Bartkowski, all the way back in 1975, I said, well, Steve, this is your life. You can hear anything that goes on between me and the Falcons that you wish. And he said, oh, of course, I want to hear it. And so I said, well, they think that you were just a best available player. You weren't a real number one pick in the first round, and they don't know about your back, and they think you're slow, and boom, boom. And he said immediately, "Get me traded. I don't ever want to play for him." So, listening to someone denigrate their talents is not a great thing. When it comes to free agency, most people, I represented 60 first-round draft picks, at times half the starting quarterbacks. So in the NFL, my relationships with owners, understanding of what comparative rosters are, the ability to be able to talk to someone in management or coaching that I've known forever and get a real answer, and to make judgments as to whether or not this is the best place for a player, are something that most people rely on. And so Daunte Culpepper, if I recall, I think a season before he left, like the season before, had one of the most amazing statistically prolific seasons imaginable, and was like runner-up for MVP of the league. And then a year later, he's sort of casting about. So I don't want to question his judgment. He knew what he wanted to do, but virtually any of us need help in life. When I do a book deal or a TV deal for myself to be the talent, I use an agent.
No, I think that speaks volumes. Leading on to that, I look at teams, and I've always looked at teams and tried to figure out why there are some franchises that continue to be competitive year in and year out. From a coaching and player side, you see stability at quarterback. I think you also see stability at head coach. Now, one might beget the other. But I also feel that ownership plays a lot in creating and maintaining a successful franchise. Do you think there are franchises that you've dealt with that are on opposite ends, meaning number one, the ones that are just, you think, fantastic, and then ones that have been difficult, or do you disagree that ownership plays that big of a part in long-term success of a franchise?
I think it all starts with ownership. Take a guy like Bob Kraft of the New England Patriots. So he had been a major success in the paper industry, had aggregated a ton of money. But when he came into the NFL, he spent hours talking to every coach, other owner, player personnel person, trying to decide what the requisites were for every single job in the organization and how you win in football. And rather than being arrogant, he went on a campaign to immerse himself. So that organization has had complete stability at the ownership level and encouragement. It's hired brilliant personnel people. It's hired great coaches, and they have a system in which the players are somewhat modular, and they know exactly what they want. And that's why they've been able to defy the typical up and down rebuilding mode, and they're always competitive. So you look at that and understand that it starts with ownership, stability, a plan, and you can win a lot of different ways. The ability to evaluate talent, and then to coach talent, and then to understand how to smoothly run a franchise. Those franchises win. So the Pittsburgh Steelers do it a very different way. They're more old guard, but I'll tell you, they produce the same results. You look at franchise like Denver, which sits near the top. All of these franchises are superbly run, and franchises not as well run. It doesn't matter what their draft position is. It doesn't matter. You could give them the same number one pick overall in the draft year after year, and they still won't win.
That's amazing. I mean, it's amazing that you put that on top. I mean, that's to me, it's something that you've seen, and I've always been curious as to why those teams are just that consistent, especially at every position, but the ability to find talent not only in players but coaches and then in the front office. And along those lines, what percentage of winning or success of a franchise is dependent upon the coaching staff and then the player personnel? And by player personnel, I mean both college scouting and pro scouting.
So that's the critical factor, is the ability to evaluate talent in terms of what will fit in your system. So again, you'd see the Patriots take players in the first round, and people look at their draft guides and they say, oh my goodness, who is that? That player is supposed to go in the third round. Well, they know how that player will perform in their system. Football is the most systemic game there is. Someone might be superb playing for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and you move him over to the New York Giants, and he's just not very effective. It's a system game, so they have to know and understand that. So it's the evaluation talent. Then it's the coaching of talent. You look at young quarterbacks, and so many of them fail, but then there are real successes, and you probably are going to look at the way they coached them, the dumbing down of the offense, the willingness to stick with him, putting him in a situation with a good offensive line and good defense. And they can't all be bad draft picks. So if in 1999 the first pick is Tim Couch and he's not in football very long, and the third pick is Akili Smith, he's not in football very long, and Cade McNown's not in football very long, they can't all be bad draft picks. So some of it is the care and breeding of players.
Now, with all the quarterbacks that you have represented, give us an example of a guy that you felt exemplified your ability to see an offense, to see a coach, to see a system, and the player that you put there really absolutely flourished. I mean, which guy and which team are you most proud of in that respect?
Well, the first real free agent in the NFL before they had free agency was Warren Moon. He was not drafted because he had already signed in Canada. So when he came back, he had his choice between virtually the CFL, USFL, NFL, and he ended up picking the Houston Oilers, and it just happened they had wonderful offensive coaching, wonderful personnel, and he flourished and made multiple Pro Bowls, and now he's in the Hall of Fame. So it's the ability to understand, or in the case of someone like Troy Aikman. So Troy comes to the Cowboys, first pick in the draft, and the first season is miserable, and someone would get discouraged. Someone would say, oh, my God, my team at UCLA was better than the Dallas Cowboys are. But you would sit and say, do you think Jerry Jones is bright and wants to win? Yes. Do you think Jimmy Johnson is a great coach? Yes. So all they're missing is input, the ability to understand and master talent acquisition and the rest of it. And do you think they're bright enough to get there? Yes. So you're patient, and then he goes on and wins 3 Super Bowls. So sometimes it's the moves you don't make by staying in place and being patient, understanding that eventually you're in a system and with coaches and front office that are going to get it right.
Well, I want to turn the conversation a little bit more toward Minneapolis. The Vikings, and we're here in flyover land, and it's cold and snowy in April, and all we could think about is football and the upcoming draft. But the big story for us here is the situation with Adrian Peterson, and I think my main question, or my main thought, is that people assume that the Vikings really hold all the cards in his kind of situation. And I've kind of seen it as really just the opposite, that in his case, Adrian holds most of the cards. What side of that fence do you fall on?
Well, again, I do think the player holds the cards, because to the extent that the Vikings need him to readjust his contract, it depends on his willingness to do that. And to the extent that he somehow feels mistreated by them, you've got a team like the Dallas Cowboys lurking out there, not tampering, but it's an obvious place to go given who they just lost. And he's from Texas, so just looking as an outsider, he may just want a fresh start. So in the case of the few superstar players in the league, you generally don't see acrimonious interactions. In other words, when's the last time you saw a quarterback negotiation for a franchise starting quarterback somehow be ugly and play out? It doesn't happen, because both sides know they need each other. Now, in the case of Peterson, obviously, the team was stuck in a really difficult situation. Here's their most valuable player, and all of a sudden this breaks publicly. It becomes a huge third-rail public issue with heavy opinion, and then the commissioner puts him on an exempt list and constricts the team in terms of contact and the rest of it. It's just inherently problematic from the start.
Yeah.
So, you'd like to think that Adrian Peterson understands that he's been a superb player, but he's had a franchise that pretty much stood behind him, and it's very difficult to replace an Adrian Peterson. I mean, you have a whole slew of running backs that are pretty good. And then you've got someone with an unparalleled ability to just keep the ball moving like he can. And so that's a major loss.
In Adrian's case, with his agent Dogra and the things that have come out, and I think in this day and age of Twitter and headlines, if you took a poll up here, people would think that, I'd say a vast majority would think that Adrian doesn't want to come back. Now, I know that behind the scenes, a lot in this negotiation process, it's ugly, and you're dealing with people, but usually that all happens behind closed doors. Has it struck you at all about how much of this dirty laundry has been aired? And would you ever want your player, if you represented a player, to ever say that he doesn't want to play in the town that he spent the last 7 or 8 years of his career?
It is a disaster, because if it ends up that he is playing there, it creates all that antipathy and bad will. Now, truthfully, if you take these situations over time, the minute he starts playing and is a prolific achiever, a lot of that goes away. But I will tell you this, I've always told players, if you want to be traded, and if there's any capacity to do it, do not ever say publicly that you want out. Because when you're doing it, you're crippling your incumbent team, because the other teams know that they have damaged goods on their hands. So they're never going to make your team an offer that is respectable enough to get you traded. They're going to make offers that would get that general manager who's your incumbent GM fired. So the point is that all of this, I can't tell you how many situations I've brokered over time that you would have no idea about. You would just assume that a trade occurred because there was a real need on both teams. But the point is that you have a public that already is uneasy about the size of athletic contracts. And the thing that they can't relate to is the fact that, even though I'll tell you these are skilled people and the business makes a lot of money, that someone would think themselves bigger than the team or bigger than the league, and it conveys a atmosphere of sort of disgruntled, spoiled player, and the public doesn't like it. notwithstanding the fact the player might have great reasons to want to leave.
Now, in part of this whole negotiation, I think the big part was the incident with Dogra and Rob Brzezinski down in Indianapolis at a restaurant in public. What's the most heated conversation or negotiation that you were in? And I think you kind of alluded to it already about how, that was, by all means, you kept that in private. But how nasty can these things get?
Well, people get intense. Now, my whole style of negotiating is to put myself in the heart and mind of the other person. See the pressures on that person. See the way, the institutional pressures, personal pressures, and try to get an understanding of their point of view. And it's only when you do that that you are able to somehow really understand the priorities of the other party and to craft a win-win situation. But so I remember there was a time Andy Robustelli, who was a really famous linebacker for the New York Giants, was their general manager. And we had a first-round draft pick. We had agreed to have him incorporated. It was a novel concept. The league disapproved, so then I wanted to redo parts of the contract that were based on that. He got so angry, he took this massive desk and he just pushed it over in my direction, and his veins were distending from his head, and, he was cursing and screaming. I never said a word about that to his owner, because the reality of the situation is that if you can't stand some tough talk, find another profession.
Yeah.
And you have to keep perspective on these things. Having anything happen in public puts both parties against the wall, as it were. And everyone's got pride. I do my utmost to never put the other side in a compromising situation, because when you do it, when you challenge them, when you make it personal, then when you think things cannot get worse, they can get worse. They can. Young men can turn old, winter can turn to spring, and you still don't have a solution. And when you're representing athletes, they have short playing lives. We don't have the indulgence of somehow allowing things to play out forever.
What does your, and this is an opinion question, I want to preface it with that, but what does your gut say on whether or not Adrian will ever be a Viking again?
Well, I think it's possible. Look, my job is to push is not to sustain the worst unrealistic illusion a client has about the world. I mean, that's easy to do if you fear getting fired. The right thing is to restore some balance there. And so you very often see situations where it just appears there's absolutely burned bridges, but they're not. Adrian's teammates are, I'm sure, accepting of him, and it's not an issue with the coach. So it's a matter of, I think in this case, just from what I've read, that if the Vikings may be put in a situation where they either have to swallow his current contract or do something with him. But what you need right now is to defuse the situation, to let it calm down, to allow the deadlock to ease and just get some perspective.
Yeah, and it seemed as if they were headed that way with the meetings with North Turner, with Zimmer, Adrian visiting ownership, and then the agent comes out and makes a statement that he doesn't think it's in the best interest for his client to be back in Minnesota. And you're right, it is very divisive, divisive. People up here are really falling on it's forcing people to go into one camp or the other. Now, as an agent,
I did that one time. when Steve Young was playing after Montana had left San Francisco, he was being held to this amazing standard by the Montana loyalists. And in their mind's eye, unless Steve won every single Super Bowl, he was not an acceptable replacement. So I went in the paper and said, Steve really should find a new place. The Montana loyalists can, would rather see the team lose with someone else than win with Steve and all the rest of it. Well, what it did is it pierced the boil and finally got people to wake up and see it wasn't Steve Young's fault that Montana came to the end of his career, and he's just trying to do the best. So it actually let the Steve went publicly and said he disagreed.
Yep.
And it let the a whole lot of the tension and divisiveness out of the balloon.
And that's the key part of it, though. I mean, it was in your camp. You never wanted to put Steve in a bad light in any way, shape, or form with the public, correct?
So the point was that I could make the point as an observer that this young player was being totally unfairly judged, and you give him a chance, or he should go somewhere else. And then people spoke up and said, no, we like Steve, and then I guess we've been too hard, and he went on to the Hall of Fame career.
One question, my last question is, the league has changed so much over the years, and it seems as if the league has become, it's about scoring. They facilitated, I think, some of the fantasy type aspects of the game. It's still very, very difficult to find a good quarterback. Do you think that it's getting harder and harder, that the teams are more and more dependent on that one position? Or is it something else? Is the college game changed, making the transition harder? What is it about that position that becomes so key to all these franchises?
A franchise quarterback, someone that you can build a team around for the next 10 to 12 years, someone you can win because of rather than with, and someone who can elevate his play in adverse circumstances to put a team on his back and carry him through, is the most important single factor in winning today at a big-time level in the NFL. And part of the problem is that because of the way the salary cap is structured, instead of these young quarterbacks being picked high and being able to come in and learn, as Aaron Rodgers did behind Brett Favre for 2 or 3 years, they are thrown into the mix immediately. And the game has a massive adjustment. The defensive players move differently. It's all a lot faster. And then we have viral media that after 3 weeks into a rookie season, not 4 years as it used to be, but 3 games, this player's a bust. This player's a bust. Well, the truth is, it's not until they get enough time on the field that they truly have the ability to read defenses and to have field command. And it's only going to come with being out there, and sometimes it's going to come with some ridiculous-looking interceptions and timeouts and play calls. You need to live through that. And there was an artificial illusion created by the instant success of RG3 and Andrew Luck and Russell Wilson that made it look so easy. Well, this doesn't happen very much. I mean, occasionally you have a Ben Roethlisberger or Dan Marino that comes in right away and is prolific. But right now we ruin these young quarterbacks because they're not given a proper amount of adjustment time, and they have to play because in the old days you had Joe Montana backed up by Steve Young, backed up by Steve Bono, any of which could play. And you don't have them anymore. Behind that rookie who's not really ready is aging veteran or a 1 or 2 year player.
Now, Lee, I lied to you. I got one more question. Have you had a chance to see Teddy Bridgewater perform at all? And do you have any thoughts on his rookie campaign?
I think he's going to be outstanding. And what you want to watch there is just progression. and it seemed to me he got better and better. And but again, they didn't rush him right in the first game, and so I think Bridgewater can be excellent, but you need to have a realistic view that until he gets enough time on the field, you're not going to see the finished product. Warren Moon once told me that when he was first in the NFL, he ran around a lot. He did it all on his arm. And he said when he looked at his game films 4 years later, he couldn't believe how scattered he was. That should happen. That should be the way it happens. You should progressively get better and better and better. In your fifth year, you should be much better than in your first.
Well, I'll tell you the good thing about that. Pete got his last question in, but, I get to move away from football with a real last question, Lee. And you're a bit of a Hollywood movie star here we're talking to, Pete. And it's been widely publicized that you were the inspiration for Tom Cruise's lead character in the movie Jerry Maguire, and you even made an appearance in that movie. But here's my question for you. If you were the casting director and you had the choice to have someone actually play the part of Lee Steinberg in a movie, who would you choose?
I think Tom Cruise was pretty good, especially for me younger. Now a 66-year-old me, who might we, Harrison Ford? I don't know. But the point is that I was just happy that Cameron Crowe spent a year and a half researching with me, and he went everywhere I went, to the draft, to league meetings, to games, and I told him tons of stories. I was just happy it sort of humanized what a sports agent is and can be, in contrast with the stereotype.
No doubt. Well, Lee, we can't thank you enough for sharing your time with the fans to help them understand what the negotiations process looks like, especially behind the scenes. But for all our listeners, you can learn so much more about what goes on behind those scenes in the sports world if you tune into Lee Steinberg's weekly Yahoo radio show, Behind Closed Doors, which airs on Monday nights from 7 to 9 p.m. Central Time. And you can still get his best-selling book, The Agent, at your local bookseller, Amazon.com, or you can even download it on iTunes. And if you want to stay in touch with the pulse of what's going on in sports, we encourage you to follow Lee on Twitter at Lee Steinberg. Lee, again, thanks for sharing your thoughts with the NFL fans and the Minnesota Viking followers today.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it. Anytime.
Take care.